Everyone, it's Michael Shermer. Before we start the show today, I wanted to tell you about our big upcoming event here in Santa Barbara, December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Friday night, we're doing an open house right here in the office where I'm recording all this. I got a food truck coming and adult beverages, going to be big fun. We're all just going to hang out. And then Saturday and Sunday, I have some terrific guests coming. I have Michael Schellenberger, who's going to be a live podcast guest. We're going to record it live at the hotel at the Hilton Beachside Resort, right on Cabrillo here in Santa Barbara. So give them a call, reserve your room, and go to skeptic.com, and right on the top banner, you'll see the conference. Be sure to sign up before it sells out. Michael Schellenberger is one of the most interesting people working today, independent journalist. He ran for governor of California. He works on homelessness. He works on nuclear power. He works on the environment, and most importantly, he works on social media. He was one of the guys that got the Twitter files from Elon and went through and found all the interesting things that were going on at Twitter before Elon bought it. So we'll be talking about all those issues and more, and getting your feedback. That is, these live podcast recordings will have a good portion of the time spent interacting with you, the audience. We're going to do that also Sunday morning with Jared Diamond, the great Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Collapse, and so forth. He's coming up from LA. He's going to spend the part of the day with us, and we're going to do another live recording, podcast recording, which I'll be in conversation with him. And then again, your dialogue with Jared will also be recorded and posted on the show here. And then finally, I got Pete Boghossian coming, who's going to do a street epistemology with all of us. That is to say, he's going to see what it would take to change your mind on various issues. For example, I'm guessing most of the people coming to the conference are the same people watch this show, read the Skeptic magazine and so on. They're probably atheists or agnostics. So what would it take for you to be a theist? Okay, so Pete's going to try a little street epistemology on us, which will be big fun. Go to skeptic.com, just click on that banner across the top, sign up before it sells out. It's going to be a terrific, big fun. Oh, and then Sunday afternoon, for those who can't make it to the open house Friday night, we'll do it again here. Another food truck coming, adult beverages, going to be big fun. See you then. All right, my guest today is Yascha Mounk, who is a writer and academic known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. Born in Germany to Polish parents, Mounk received his BA in history from Trinity College, Cambridge, and his PhD in government from Harvard University. Oh, you're one of those elite guys. All right. He's a professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, the founder of the digital magazine Persuasion, contributing editor at The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Oh, another one of those inside conspiracy people. And he's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and Slate. He's the author of numerous books, including The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure, which was featured on Barack Obama's summer reading list last year, by the way. That was pretty cool. The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. A Stranger in My Own Country, A Jewish Family in Modern Germany. And his new book, here it is, The Identity Trap, The Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time. And his podcast is called The Good Flight. Hey, I heard some good news on this. I think this was on your Twitter feed, Yasha, that your publisher has run out of copies because it's been bought up so rapidly. So congratulations on that.
That's right. For my publisher, gets angry with me if I emphasize that too much. So I think print copies I think are being printed today as we record, and by the time that everybody listens to this episode, if you go to your favorite local bookstore, or if you go to one of the big evil websites where you can buy books, you should be able to get the books. Don't let it discourage you, or I'll get in trouble with my publisher.
Very good. Well, I listened to the audio edition in addition to looking through the hardback edition, so it's
and that too is not sold out. So
yes, that's right. Yeah, digital versions are endless. They're limited by the number that purchased that. Yeah. Well, all right. I'm going to open with reading page 1 of your book, which was written long before current events in the Middle East. All 4 of my grandparents were sent to prison for their communist beliefs during the 1920s or 1930s. All 4 decided to stay in Central Europe after most of their family members were murdered in the Holocaust because they were convinced that new leftist governments would make the world a better place, managing to overcome the prejudices and tribal hatreds that had, during their lifetimes, twice set the world aflame. By the time I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, their political views had fundamentally changed. They had belatedly come to recognize the cruelty of Soviet communism. Instead of the revolutionary Marxism of their youth, they were now committed to a reformist creed of social democracy that attempted to humanize capitalism by admixing a strong welfare state to it. But one commitment remained unwavering through those tragic and turbulent decades. As in their youth, they believed that the historical mission of the left consisted of expanding the circle of human sympathy across the boundaries of family, tribe, religion, and ethnicity. To be on the left was to believe that humans matter equally, irrespective of the group to which they belong, that we should aim for forms of political solidarity that transcend group identities rooted in race or religion, and that they can make common cause in pursuit of universal ideas like justice and equality. All right, contrast that with these Westerners in Sydney chanting "gas the Jews" and "fuck the Jews." I just cannot believe what I'm hearing. You must be shocked. This is what has happened to the left. Let's start there with your personal story a little bit. Do you have family members, friends, people in Israel you're concerned about? Has this affected you personally?
I don't know, because my grandparents were communists who didn't believe in Zionism, right? Who chose after World War II to go back to Poland to help build up the communist regime. And when that communist regime ended up turning on them in 1967, there was about 50,000 Jews left in Poland. And by 1970, that number was down to 500 because of state-sponsored anti-Semitic pogroms. So it's certainly not the first time that the left is turning on Jews, or that it's failing to live up to its universalist creed. But I do think that some of what we've seen on the Western left in the last weeks speaks to the problems that I explain in the book. There's chapters of the Democratic Socialists for America that called for protests at which Hamas was glorified. There's a chapter in Chicago of Black Lives Matter that actually featured paragliders on their invitation for a pro-Palestinian, or in this case, really pro-Hamas protest, glorifying the people, the terrorists who murdered 1,400 civilians in Israel, who murdered over 250 people at a music festival in the south of Israel. And that is connected to the change of the nature of the left over the last years. The left has never been perfect. It is in part responsible for very bad things in the 20th century. But the reason why it was so appealing to many well-intentioned people was this promise to say, we recognize that some people are being treated badly or because of a group into which they're born, whether that's an economic class or an identity group, right? Then we are going to build a world in which we can understand each other. We can stand in solidarity with each other. We can build institutions that treat us as equals, irrespective of where we're from. That was the grand promise of the left. That's why I am and remain a man of the left. That is the ideas that I was attracted to as a young man. That's the ideas that in a different way my grandparents were attracted to when they were young. Today, big parts of the left say no. Those values have never helped us make progress. America today is as racist and as homophobic as it ever was. And so we need to get rid of those universal aspirations. If you stand at a different intersection of identities to me, I can't understand you, right? If I am inspired by your culture, by the things that you bring with you, that is dangerous. We should be concerned about cultural appropriation. We don't think that we're going to make progress by defending values like free speech. We need to institute a consequence culture where people are punished for speech that is somehow politically inconvenient. And more broadly, it is a view in which I always interpret everything through identity groups. So there's white people who are bad and complicit in injustice, and there's people of color who are good and who have been historically oppressed. Jews count as white, even though most Jews in Israel today are Mizrahim, who were thrown out of Middle Eastern countries since 1945. We don't have a very clear visual difference to Palestinians. But Israelis are white and Palestinians are people of color, so therefore one side is good and one side is bad. Israelis are settlers, even though the Jews originate in Palestine, and a lot of Mizrahi Jews fled to Israel when they were thrown out of Middle Eastern countries, whereas Palestinians are the indigenous population. So Jews, Israelis are bad, Palestinians are good. That is what helps to explain all of the events of the last years. And if you endorse a conception of injustice or of racism, that always depends on the group of which you're part. If you say racism is structural, such that me hating you doesn't count as racism if I'm from an oppressed group and you're from a supposedly dominant group, then you end up with the student statement of many organizations at Harvard University saying Israel is wholly responsible for the fact that Hamas sent its terrorists to slaughter civilians.
Yeah, it's just shocking to hear those sorts of things. And in the light of what you just said, which is what your book is about, so it's a nice summary, is it that the oppressor-oppressed model, is it that Israel is powerful, they are a successful, powerful economy, they have nuclear weapons, they have a powerful military, they're backed by the United States, the most powerful country in history, therefore they have to be oppressors, they're the bad guys, regardless of what actually happens?
Yeah, so part of this is that the broader context of the Israel-Palestine conflict is very complicated, right? And there's different historical competing narratives about, Israel did this, the Palestinians rejected that peace deal, the settlers did this, Hezbollah did that. I mean, you can wind up with those very complicated competing claims about how we got into the mess. What's clear is that the Israeli government is not without fault, but part of its settlement policy is misguided, that it has sometimes engaged in military action, that has killed civilians. All of that is fine. And I completely support the right of people to criticize the Israeli government. And I completely think that our media should put what happens in the context of a very complex set of historical developments over the course of 75 years, and if you want, over the course of centuries. But what it cannot do is to obfuscate the actual facts of what is happening right now. What it cannot do is, in the days after this clearly terrorist massacre of innocent civilians, to refuse to use the term terrorist it would use in any other context. What it cannot do is, after the worst murder of civilians in a terror attack, one of the worst anywhere in the last decades, and the worst of Jews and Israelis since the Holocaust, run headlines saying both sides reeling, because you had a terrorist attack kill 1,400 innocents on one side, and then a military response firing some rockets on the other side. By the way, Hamas also fired rockets at Israel, so it's returning rockets in this particular case. That is not putting this series of events in the context of a wider and more complicated conflict. It's simply failing to report on what's going on. And if then, 10 days later, the organization that just murdered 1,400 civilians, deliberately murdered civilians, which is a difference from what Israel has been doing, sends a press release saying an Israeli rocket has killed 500 people at a hospital in Gaza, you cannot send push alerts, as the BBC did and as CNN did and the New York Times did, to millions of people saying Israeli rocket kills 500 people at Gaza hospital, Palestinian health authorities say. Right? First of all, it's your job, as people have said in the history of journalism, that if one person said it's raining and the other person says it's not raining, to look out the damn window and figure out for yourself whether it's raining or not. So just repeating this claim is wrong. Secondly, saying that this is the Palestinian health authorities is obfuscating the fact that they are coterminous in the Gaza Strip with Hamas, that just perpetrated this terrible terror attack. And thirdly, it turned out to be wrong. It turned out, in the vast preponderance of evidence, in the assessment of many independent experts, in the assessment also of the US intelligence agencies, to have been a misfired rocket sent by Islamic Jihad, a terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip aligned with Hamas. And finally, thankfully, luckily, because every civilian victim is a tragedy, whether Israeli or Palestinian, it now appears very likely that the death toll was much lower than originally advertised. Of course, nobody is able, minutes after a rocket explosion like that, to know exactly the number of deaths. So we should have always treated those numbers with great suspicion. Most estimates now put the death toll somewhere between 100 and 300. Still a very tragic event, still an event that should make us mourn for every one of those victims. But again, very different from the claims that news organizations credulously reported in the first minutes after this attack.
Yeah, hard to believe that big organizations like the New York Times, CNN, BBC would not have some understanding of that. Basic journalism? Is it that they're just blinded by their own ideological narratives that they think it has to be, and they just don't even see what they did initially?
Yeah, I mean, look, I believe, as I think you do, that we should always ascribe to incompetence,
Yes,
rather than malice. If that's, I think there is moral confusion here because, again, the roles of victim and perpetrator in the broader context are very complicated. And so that bleeds into not wanting to make it clear in particular instances. I think there was a sense of false balance where after these outlets were finally forced to actually report on the sheer horror of the, killing, of babies and grandmothers in the most horrific way, of a kidnapping of about 200 people into the Gaza Strip. They wanted to show that they're independent, and therefore it felt apropos to say, hey, how convenient. Here is something where Israel did something wrong. We can splash that across the website and thereby demonstrate that we're balanced, even if that balance might turn out in the end to be false. And there may also just be straight up bias involved in some of those cases. That's perfectly possible. Now, by the way, the reason why I care about this, and my sense from your work and your magazine is that you will share this, is that we need those institutions, right? The problem is that if we have a society where you can't trust the newspapers, if you have a society where people stop trusting mainstream institutions like universities because they appear to be biased, that's a problem, because a society without trusted institutions like that is going to get us to very hot water. It's going to get us into a world where all you have is fake news and conspiracy theories and narratives that people are spinning. And so one of the reasons why I'm so angry at this failure is not that I dislike those institutions, but that I care about them, that I deeply believe that we need them for society to function well. But I believe that by and large are still superior to the alternatives, but that makes it all the more galling when they screw up as badly as they have over the last weeks.
Well, the alternative is the Trump conspiracy theory, which is a lot of people are saying that's right. It. That's the entire theory. And if that's as good as the New York Times said it, or CNN or whatever, then we're lost.
No, absolutely. And that's sort of, I think there's sort of three positions here. And perhaps I've changed my mind or changed fronts in this a little bit. I think there's the credulous position, which says, if a mainstream says something, then it must be true. If the New York Times reports on something, it must be true. If, a study from academics at some renowned university says something, then it must be true. And perhaps, I don't know how credulous I used to be, but I think I tended to give the benefit of a doubt to mainstream institutions in the past to an extent, but I no longer would, right? Then there's the opposite position, which says always mistrust the mainstream, right? If it's wrong to always be for the current thing, then I'm always going to be against the current thing, right? If the New York Times says A, I immediately jump to the conclusion that it must be non-A. That is as misguided, and it ironically allows mainstream institutions to determine your beliefs every bit as much, because you will simply believe the opposite of what they say, which actually means you're outsourcing in an indirect way your own beliefs, your own judgment to those institutions, right? I think what we need to do is to do the middle position, which is that epistemically we need institutions and we need experts and all of those things to make sense of the world. By and large, organizations like the New York Times are better than the average Twitter account. But we should not be naive about the fact that these institutions are composed of flesh and blood human beings who have their own limitations and shortcomings, about the fact that they can become subject to groupthink, and about the fact that they have their own biases. And so we should interrogate them closely and be friendly critics precisely because we want these institutions to perform better.
As a scholar of democracies and the press, are you encouraged by the last few years' rise of independent journalism, people like Barry Weiss and the Free Press? But there's a lot of sites like that now that seem to be getting reasonable funding to do real journalism as an alternative to the mainstream media. And podcasts are huge, with gigantic audiences, much bigger than, say, CNN and Anderson Cooper. And they don't seem to be ideologically captured, or at least not yet.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it's very good for there to be a great variety of media formats and sources, right? The real danger comes when one type of medium employing one sort of person who move in the same kind of milieu, who go to the same kinds of dinner parties, dominate all of the public conversation. Not because that would allow them to sort of pull off some grand conspiracy, but because the real danger of groupthink comes in more informal ways, right? If you're part of the same milieu, it's easy to discount the same kinds of things without looking at them carefully, to come to believe the same kind of thing, to worry that if I express a certain kind of opinion, suddenly at the dinner party, people are no longer going to be very nice to me, so perhaps better not look into that too closely. And so I think it's great that we have a much broader, more various media landscape. I think, our mainstream media is often pretty good, but it gets some things badly wrong. But it probably doesn't make the craziest claims, right? A lot of these independent podcasts, for example, they can be really good. They can surface things that are important. They can start to debate things like the lab leak theory, which was just defined out of existence in the mainstream media. And I still don't know whether or not it's true. I'm sure you have interesting views on that. But certainly it is a theory that is now taken seriously at the highest level of the intelligence community, at the highest level of science. Thank God for independent media outlets that allowed us to start and to have that discussion. That's a really good thing. But doesn't mean that the sort of average big podcast is going to have a better batting average than the New York Times. It'll probably have a lower batting average than the New York Times, but it can be a very healthy corrective. The last thing I'll just say is, in a similar vein, if you're an unconcerning consumer of Twitter, you end up with all kinds of mush in your brain. But by the same token, after the Hamas attack on southern Israel, and again after the attack on the hospital in Gaza, spending 5 or 10 minutes on Twitter, if you follow some sensible folks, gave you vastly better information about what was going on when you spent 5 or 10 minutes surfing the websites of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And so these are mixed blessings, but ones that I think complement our ecosystem in very healthy ways.
Yeah, all the examples we just gave of these student groups at Harvard and the people chanting "Gas the Jews" and Greta Thunberg, siding with Hamas and so on. But the amount of outrage that I see on my Twitter feed anyway about that is, encouraging. Like, okay, so yeah, there are these crazy lefties, but there's plenty who are not going with that.
Well, so my new book, The Identity Trap, I've been going around talking about it for a good few weeks now. And in the first weeks of book tour, I kept getting the question of, why focus on this stuff? There's dangerous people like Trump, and there's all these conspiracy theorists on the right, and all of that bad stuff. Why should we care about a few people thinking silly things on the left? Miraculously, I haven't gotten that question in the last 2 weeks, because I do think that people have recognized that no matter how well-intentioned they may claim to be, these bad ideas on the left can have bad real-world consequences, can lead to dehumanizing views, right? One of the things I kept saying is that I think it felt abstract to people. My problem is not that these ideas go too far in the right direction. I think that's often what sort of reasonable critics of these ideas want to say, right? Like, well, it's kind of not too farism, right? Like, these kids are well-intentioned, kids are a little radical, and perhaps they're exaggerating a little bit. But the heart is in the right place, we're going in the right direction. In terms of intentions, all of that may be true. I think most people are the heroes in their own movie, and they generally think we're making the world a better place. Not everybody, but most people, sure. But in terms of the impact they're having, in terms of what the world would actually look like if we embraced those ideas, in terms of their ability to allow us to analyze the world, this is not a case of going too far in the right direction. It's a case of taking us very much in the wrong direction. And I think that has started to become much more clear, much more apparent to people in the last weeks.
Yeah. Last week I wrote my Skeptic Substack column on moral equivalency arguments, because what I was hearing from the left sounded very much like the Holocaust deniers back in the 90s, saying, people like David Irving, the Nazis, they did some bad things, but, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Dresden, Hamburg, the mass bombings, killing civilians, and, there's bad people on both sides, basically. We heard the same thing this last week. I wonder if you think, is that coming from a kind of a liberal idea that a binary black and white simplistic view of the world in which there's good people and bad people often leads to bad outcomes, that, people are not just pure good and pure evil, and that it's not helpful to characterize it that way. And that's maybe the motive to not want to condemn Hamas just blatantly like that.
No, I don't think so. It's a really good and perceptive question. I actually think that distinguishes an older moral relativism that the left could fall into, and one that I think was a mistake, but that had a humanistic element from the new ideology that's arisen now. So I do think that there is a kind of left-wing instinct of, you try to understand every person, right? Like the terrible criminal who performs terrible crimes. But what does he feel inside? And perhaps he had a hard childhood, and if only somebody was nice to him, then perhaps he would turn his life around, right? That is a kind of old-fashioned lefty and liberal instinct. And I think it can sometimes lead you really badly astray. There's some Woody Allen movie where, somebody takes in a murderer and so on after they're released from prison. And of course, it all turns out to go very badly. I forget what the name of the movie is, right? You can make fun of it and make fun of it for good reason, because sometimes it can put you in a dangerous position. But there's something charming and lovely about that, right? The determination to see the best in everybody and to say, look, perhaps you're doing something terrible. Perhaps you have an ideology that's seemingly terrible, but isn't there something human about you that we can try and empathize with and understand? And shouldn't that make us a little bit sympathetic to you? Again, I don't think that's the best guide to the world, but I actually find that there's something about that is winning, right? I think today the idea really is quite different. It is to say that people are defined by the group of which they are a part. And so the moral status is defined by whether that group is a group of historical guilt, a group of perpetrators, or whether it is a group of historical victims, of people who are morally beyond reproach. And rather than assessing each action on the basis of what you're actually doing, what effect it is having, whether it's justified, we're only going to look at, well, which group are you a part of, and how does that help us understand this? So perhaps I alluded to it earlier, but it might be helpful to spell out a little bit more closely the way in which people have changed how they think about racism. So there is a straightforward, classic, traditional definition of what racism entails. And broadly speaking, that is first personal beliefs about other groups that are negative or demeaning or dehumanizing, right? Well, I think that members of Group X are terrible, inferior, violent, stupid, whatever in these ways, right? That is a racist belief. People have rightly pointed out that this doesn't fully capture the mechanisms through which racial injustices are perpetrated in society. The traditional example here from the 1990s, that has become less relevant in the age of Uber and Lyft, but I think is illuminating, is about a Black American and African American trying to hail a cab, right? And they're trying to hail the cab, they stand by the side of the road, and one cab after the next keeps driving past. And Perhaps some of those cabbies are racist. Perhaps they don't like black people, right? They're racist in that first sense. But perhaps what's going on is more complicated. Perhaps they know that an African American is likely to live in a neighborhood that is less affluent. And in that neighborhood, it might be harder for the cabbie to pick up the next fare, right? Perhaps some of the cabbies who are driving past are themselves black, right? They're not racist against black people. They simply recognize that economically they have an incentive to, drive further down the block and pick up the white passenger who's more likely to, go to an affluent neighborhood, right? That's a form of structural racism. This African American passenger, even if they have the money to pay the fare, even if they live in a really nice neighborhood, is suffering from a form of racial stereotyping that has these negative effects. And so I think that we should embrace the concept of structural racism. I think it's a helpful way of thinking about the world. The problem comes when, as many people have, and as orientations at campus often explicitly demand, some dictionary definitions have now embraced, the concept of racism comes to be exclusively structural. When Vice magazine writes that it is impossible for a black person to be racist towards a white person because a black person comes from a less dominant group, and our understanding of racism should be exclusively structural. Well, that makes it impossible to capture when a black Hebrew Israelite in Jersey City murders 3 Jews because of anti-Semitic beliefs. It makes it impossible for us to recognize that that too was a form of racism, right? Because the black person is supposedly more marginalized than the Jew, and so therefore, if you only have a structural understanding of racism, you can't understand that. Right? And then on top of that, you have the embrace of a really narrow American view of how race functions. So what does Whoopi Goldberg end up saying? The Holocaust was not about racism because Jews are white. How can you be racist against white people, right? The Nazis did not think of Jews as Aryans. They thought that there was a racial distinction there, right? And so it was very much racially motivated. But if you just impose the American view on things, then you can't recognize this. And so this ends up explaining the Middle East, the response to parts of the Middle East conflict, right?
Yeah, but does that...
Palestinians are the people who are marginalized. They are the people who are coded as people of color, right? And so it cannot be the case that Hamas has murderous, racist, genocidal views about Jews. It doesn't fit into that scheme.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, just thought, if you're going to channel a Steven Pinker-like argument with a series of graphs and charts showing the decline of racist attitudes in America in the last 75 years, it looks like it's great progress, then you can just say, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about people's inner states of mind about people of color. I'm talking about the structural stuff, which is different.
So you broke up for a sec. Could you just repeat that?
Oh, that if you're going to make a Steven Pinker-like argument that look at all these graphs and charts showing the decline of racist attitudes amongst Americans in the last half century, that's progress, then the structural racist argument could say, we're not talking about that. We're talking about something completely different, and that's not gotten better.
Yeah, so I think, again, I guess I would distinguish there. I think that the argument of structural racism in itself is perfectly legitimate. It's a helpful way of understanding the world. But then you need to actually be able to show particular instances of structural racism. And you need to actually be able to demonstrate those. Now, in some contexts, that's possible, right? I mean, it's quite easy, actually, to run a study. Again, this feels a little bit outdated because of Uber and so on, but it's quite easy to run a study where you put 5 well-dressed white people and 5 well-dressed black people on the corner of a street and see how long it takes each of them to hail a cab, right? This is not something that sort of is in the imagination of a beholder or something like that. You can do good, straightforward social science demonstrating that effect. One way that people have done that is to send CVs to employers for first-round interviews. And exactly the same CV, except that you have names that are coded white and names that are coded black, or in France, names that are coded native French, and names that are coded immigrant or Muslim, right? And you see at what rate they're called back, right? Those are ways of trying to capture some of those forms of structural racism that I think are perfectly measurable and important and sensible. Now, what's right is that in the last years, we have sometimes embraced in the United States a kind of moral panic where we start to make unfalsifiable claims about racism. And in particular, where any discrepancy in outcome is treated as, by definition, motivated by structural racism, right? So if members of different groups have different SAT scores, that must be because the SATs themselves are somehow racist, which, by the way, is a really idiotic point of view because it doesn't take the core insight of the history of racial injustice seriously, right? Like, of course, African Americans will, on average, have lower SAT scores, not because the SAT scores are somehow biased against them, but because due to slavery and Jim Crow and other factors for 200 years, they've had serious socioeconomic disadvantages, right? And obviously, socioeconomic disadvantages correlate with how well you're going to do on the SAT. You don't have to have some theory, some weird theory about a miraculous way in which these very abstract questions that are anonymously graded discriminate against Black test takers. You have a much more straightforward theory that ironically refers to the serious history of racism in the United States as well. So those kind of explanations, I think, do become a real problem. You see this in political science as well. It used to be that you studied racism in a straightforward way because people were open about the racism. So you could ask people, would you want to have a Black person as your neighbor, right? Do you think that Black people are inferior in some kind of way? And a bunch of people would say, no, I don't want a Black person as my neighbor, right? Like, yes, I do think they're inferior. And then you could see how that correlates with other kinds of political outcomes, right? Thankfully, most people no longer hold those beliefs. And to some extent, people who do hold those beliefs no longer want to express them openly because of a social desirability bias. So you can't study racism in that way anymore. It's not very fruitful. So what's happened in social science is that you have something called the implicit racism scale. And this is very widely used. And when newspaper articles based on those studies are written up, they gloss over the details and say it's racism that's being measured, right? But you look at those studies, and some of them simply correlate with Republican public policy positions. Some of them say things like, Irish and Italians managed to succeed without special favors. African Americans should be able to as well. You might agree with that or disagree with that. It's a complicated question. But to treat that as a metric for racism is silly, particularly when the studies even say, support for Trump is driven by racism. What you've actually done is to say people who think that we shouldn't have policies like affirmative action are more likely to vote for Trump. Well, of course, because Trump opposes affirmative action and Democrats support affirmative action. There's a great study in which some political scientists at Harvard and other places applied the implicit racism scale to Estonians. So they asked a bunch of people, Irish and Italians managed to succeed on their own. Estonians should be able to do the same today, right? They just substituted African Americans with Estonians. And it turns out that according to the implicit racism scale, Americans are deeply prejudiced and racist against Estonians. That's a really effective reductio ad absurdum of this metric. And yet political scientists are going right on using it. And newspapers are going right on writing up those studies in an uncritical manner.
Yeah, the implicit association test, we've published quite a bit on that. Another one of those.
So this is different from the implicit association test. The implicit association test is related, but it's slightly different.
Yeah. Okay, these students chanting "Gas the Jews" or the Harvard student groups and so on, all these examples. Is there a charitable way to look at that? I mean, I've been ranting all week about, I didn't know anti-Semitism and Jew hatred was still around so deeply, but is it that they're not really thinking that? They're just virtue signaling to their tribe? Yes, I know I'm supposed to say good things about Palestine, so I'm going to sign this document that I don't even read. Or they're just repeating things because other people are repeating it and they're just caught up in the kind of social contagion of the moment. And that if you had them in the privacy of your of a room, that they wouldn't say things like, I hate Jews and I think Jews should be exterminated or anything like that. Is there a charitable way to look at all this?
Well, let me say two things. One is that I have more sympathy for Palestinians and Palestinian Americans than I do for, lefty radicals that don't have any connection to the place. right? I think, one thing I've learned from studying how groups work and from reading history is that, an in-group bias goes very deep. And the task of a liberal democracy is to keep that in check, to make sure that we can get along, live with each other in tolerance despite the tendency we all have towards in-group bias, right? So, if your parents or grandparents are from Palestine, if you feel a deep connection to the place, if you have friends or family who live in Gaza and you're worried about what may happen to them in the coming days or weeks, I have some amount of empathy, not just, of course, for those fears, but also for the ways in which that might make you sort of unfair in your assessments of Hamas, or unwilling to focus on the suffering on the other side. If this is, graduate students at Yale University trying to prove how radical and uncompromising and so on they are, and as a form of kind of lifestyle pose, they are, celebrating Hamas in the way that some person queers for Hamas, and you think, well, have you actually read anything about what happens to sexual minorities in those territories? I have to say, I have sort of rather less sympathy and patience for that. So that's one distinction I draw. The other distinction is, there are the people who proactively celebrate Hamas. The people who put paragliders on the posters or posted them on the social media accounts. And that is just evil. I mean, that really is just, it reminds me of a great skit by two British comedians whose name escapes me right this second, Webb and Mitchell.
Yes, I know those guys. Yeah,
where they show two people in VSS.
The baddies.
And one of them says, why do we have skulls everywhere? Why is all of our symbolism skulls? I mean, couldn't we have had a nicer symbol? And we sort of reflect on this for a couple of minutes. And finally, one of them says, are we the baddies? I mean, if you put on your political propaganda the image of paragliders who appeared from the sky to murder over 250 people from all over the world, by the way, Jews and non-Jews, Israelis, but also Americans, Canadians, people from Asia and Europe, at a music festival, you should ask yourself, am I the baddie? Now, that I think perhaps, again, is a little bit different from the people who are not proactively celebrating Hamas, but who are unwilling to condemn Hamas. That is also a moral failing. I think any reasonable person must condemn what Hamas did. But I think that is sort of driven by a form of desire that, again, is quite human, to reduce cognitive dissonance. Right? You think, overall, the plight of the Palestinians is more just than the plight of Israelis. Let me not focus on the aspects of this that complicate my narrative. And we're all quite capable of defining out of existence forms of suffering that we feel are politically inconvenient, or that we don't want to or can't do something about. Right? So in a very different context, I'm always struck by how little we talk about the suffering of people in North Korea, because there's nothing we can do about it. So it's sort of inconvenient to think about, right? Why dwell on it when the only way to remedy it would be to go to war with a nation with 1 million soldiers that has nuclear, that has rockets and possible nuclear power and so on. Like, clearly we don't want to do that, right? So let's just ignore that suffering, right? I think there's a similar mechanism here where people, call for a ceasefire without mentioning the 200 hostages that are in the hands of Hamas. It's a moral outrage. It's a deep moral failing, but I think you can see how it might be driven by that desire to reduce cognitive dissonance and the desire to ignore suffering if it doesn't fit into your political narrative.
Do you have an opinion about the bigger question, why the Jews? Why has there always been anti-Semitism? Why is there still even anti-Zionism or anti-Israel? There's what I tweeted the other day, there's 1.2 billion Muslims and 50 Muslim majority countries. There's 16 million Jews in one Jewish state. Why the Jews now or forever? Why is it that way?
Well, that's a
big question.
Complicated question, right? I mean, part of it is patricide, right? I mean, part of it is that Judaism is the oldest of the Abrahamic religions, and so there's an anxiety of influence, a desire to take your revenge on the parent religion. That obviously has led to a lot of theological anti-Semitism, both in Christianity and in Islam. I think there's a structural fact that Jews have always been minorities in other countries. And unfortunately, a lot of countries have struggled with how to treat minority populations. So, in the history of humanity, the fact that a minority might be repressed, expelled, murdered, subjected to forms of genocide is not an inevitable occurrence, but it's hardly a rare occurrence in other contexts as well.
That's true, yeah.
And then finally, I wonder whether there is something about the fact that Jews have, certainly in the last 2 or 3 centuries, historically overachieved and outperformed. And they're not alone in that. Parsis in India, Chinese minorities across a lot of Southeast Asia have also been minority groups that ended up achieving highly and attracting the ire of the local population, in part for that reason. And I think that may be an element here as well.
Yeah, I often say that, the anti-Semitism and the restriction of Jews going into most professions led them to cluster in a handful of other professions in which they exceeded. And then the conspiracy theories, oh, look, there's a cabal of those Jews doing that one thing.
Yeah. And for various reasons, Jews ended up being very well equipped for modern conditions, in part because of the biblical is often the wrong word, in terms of the religious emphasis on literacy and on argument over interpretation of the Torah and so on, all of which set Jews up very well to succeed in kind of a developing industrial bourgeois society in the 19th, 20th century, right? And in part, as you're saying, the restriction from agriculture, from owning land, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe in the Pale of Settlement, again set them up to move more quickly to the cities, to move more quickly to the parts of professions and industries that ended up having outsized reward over the course of the last 2 centuries. So there is an ironic way in which a theological anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages pushed Jews, often in great poverty for many centuries, into niches and professions that then, after the Industrial Revolution took off, allowed them to have outsized success. And that outsized success then in turn inspired more prejudice against them.
But even the idea that, there's an overabundance of Jews in, banking, finance, Hollywood, whatever it is. Why is that a metric? That's almost like a Ibram X. Kendi definition of racism. If there's any difference in percentage of representatives of our race in any profession, that's a sign of racism.
Yeah, I think Jews really need to run an advertising campaign to make the world more aware of Parsis, because Parsis are much worse than us. There's about 50,000 Parsis in the world today, and one of the great Indian conglomerates, Tata, is owned by Parsis. The lead singer of one of the all-time great bands in the history of mankind, Freddie Mercury, is a Parsi. So on a head-to-head level, the Parsis have us beat. I think perhaps we need to distract a little bit from the hatred that conspiracy theories have for us by making them realize and learn more about Parsis. I'm joking, of course, but it's, there are small groups that end up having outside success in different contexts. For all kinds of historical and cultural reasons. And Jews are not alone in that.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about identity politics. Is it really the identity or is it the politics? I'll give you an example. Glenn Loury, Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, Larry Elder. Just name any black conservatives, and the response to that is, oh, they're not really what? They're race traitors, or they're not really black, or they're whatever it is, self-hating black, whatever the explanation is. Why aren't they embraced?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I write about extensively in the book. Ayanna Pressley is the best expression of that line that you're ventriloquating. You obviously don't believe in it yourself. She said at one point, I don't want any more black politicians who are not a black voice. I don't want any more brown politicians who are not a brown voice. I don't want any more queer politicians who are not a queer voice. And the question, of course, becomes, well, who is the black voice? Is it Ayanna Pressley herself? Is it Glenn Loury? Or is it Jim Clyburn? They all have very, very different politics. I think probably most African Americans are broadly on the line of Jim Clyburn, but some of them, who's sort of a moderate Dem, sort of center-left, but some of them are going to be on the line of Ayanna Pressley, and some of them are going to be on the line of Glenn Loury, right? The idea that any one of them has an exclusive claim to speak for the group is as absurd than if you ask, well, who is the true voice of white people? Is it Joe Biden or Donald Trump? Well, it depends which white person, right? Donald Trump certainly is not my voice, but there's lots of white people who are going to say he is my voice, right? Why do we find that claim that there should be, only white politicians who are white voice? Why don't we find that any less absurd than the idea that there's going to be a black politician who's a voice for black people in this kind of way? The great civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, a gay black political activist, though I'm not sure that he would want to foreground those adjectives in this kind of way, said that the idea of a homogeneous black community is the invention of white elites as well as of certain black people who want to lead it, right? And that, I think, describes the situation very, very well. And this is important because it speaks to our model for political solidarity, right? And on parts of the identitarian left today, people are going to say, if you, Michael, stand at a different intersection of identities to me, I'm never going to be able to understand you. And so therefore, I should defer to the political judgment of a spokespeople of your group. That's what it is to be a good ally, right? But that has a number of problems with it. It has a problem, first of all, that most people are not going to do that. Most people just aren't sufficiently motivated by social justice to say, I don't understand what this group's experience is and what they're asking for, but I realize I have this abstract duty to defer to them, so defer I do. Like, most people are not going to do that, right? But even the people who do are going to pick the spokesperson with whom they agree, right? If they're more conservative, they're going to say Glenn Loury speaks for black people, right? If they're center-left, they're going to say, well, Jim Clyburn is the true voice of black people, right? If they're super progressive, they're going to say, well, obviously, Ayanna Pressley is the one who speaks for black people. This is a really weird game where you end up making a quite unpleasant argument from authority. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to recognize that, of course, our social identity helps to determine what kind of experiences we have, right? But I, as a guy, am less likely to experience sexual harassment on the subway. And so perhaps I don't quite understand what that feels like. Perhaps I don't quite understand how frustrating it is for my female friends to worry about whether they can still safely take the subway at 10:30 p.m., right? But I absolutely can understand the politically salient aspects of that. If I have an open mind, if I speak to my friends, if I read novels, if I watch television, I can come to understand the fact that a lot of women are worried about taking the subway at night. Might not be able to walk in their shoes entirely, but I get that restricts their mobility in a serious way. And by the way, I then, from my own values, can formulate why that's an injustice, right? I don't want to live in a society where your ability to move around freely depends on whether you're a man or a woman, right? I don't need to defer to women and their struggle. This is an affront to my own vision of a kind of society I want to live in. So I think rejecting this standpoint theory and this idea of how to delegate is actually an important element for conception of, an important precondition for conception of political solidarity, but is simultaneously more realistic and more ambitious.
Yeah, well, that's the the basis of moral progress and expanding the moral sphere or moral circle is the ability to transport yourself in your own mind into somebody else's head and imagine what it would be like, and then take the Rawlsian thought experiment. All right, if I was going to design a society with laws, and I don't know which group I'm going to be in, then I have to do it in a neutral way. That's not hard to understand. I mean, it's been, for a century, we've been getting better and better at that. And that, that is one of the drivers of moral progress.
Yeah, and this is where, again, going back to the theme that what's really going on here is that it's taking us in the wrong direction, not that it's taking us too far in the right direction. I think a great example of this is the new ban on so-called cultural appropriation. Right? When I was growing up in Europe, the people who worried about cultural purity, the people who worried about the influence that other groups might have on your culture or the way that they might soak up yours, were on the right.
Yeah.
So there were ethno-nationalists, people like Viktor Orban, who thought we should have one nation and one culture and one state and true Hungarianness, right? Well, today, a lot of those concerns, some of them persist on the right, but a lot of them have moved to the left, right? The idea that we should put under a general pole of suspicion the mutual cultural influence that different groups might have in a deeply diverse democracy like the United States is now a left-wing concern. It is left-leaning editors and Hollywood executives and so on that say, do you have a right to tell the story? It is left-leaning music producers who say, this band is influenced by some traditional music in a different part of the world. Is that really going to fly? Is that something that we're allowed to do? It is left-leaning actors who have apologized for voicing or acting roles that don't match their gender identity. My favorite example is if you've watched BoJack Horseman, a very nice animated series, very lovely show, very interesting show that is mostly consistent of talking animals, but also has some human beings in it. And Alison Brie apologized for voicing a character who's Asian American in a show whose lead character is a horse. So why does this stuff matter? Well, it matters because, first of all, it gets wrong why certain supposed instances of cultural appropriation are unjust. So, the poor example here is people in the 1950s and 1960s, white musicians stealing the music of black musicians or being inspired by them, having big careers when the black musicians didn't. The injustice in the 50s and 60s was not that there was some white jazz saxophonist somewhere. The injustice is that black musicians could not travel freely across the American South, that they could not stay at some of the hotels in which they performed, that they were banned from many concert venues, that they wouldn't be played on many radio stations, that they couldn't be signed by many record labels. That's what was unjust about it. And so if you get that wrong, you also get wrong how you solve this. The way to solve that injustice was not to make sure that white musicians don't play jazz music or rock and roll or whatever. It was to make sure that black musicians and African Americans more broadly overcome the deep discrimination that they faced at the time. And
yeah, I saw some of that after the Elvis biopic came out, and that, he had all this influence of black gospel musicians of the 40s and 50s. But all music is culturally appropriated. Right. No one makes music entirely
all
from
parts
scratch.
of our culture
all of
are
it.
a form of cultural appropriation. Every element of our cuisine, of the way we write, the technology we use today is an accrual of past cultural appropriation. And so if we put those forms of mutual cultural influence under general pole of suspicion, not only will we forgo amazing cultural innovations and technological innovations that hopefully we will achieve as a human race in the coming decades and centuries, but we're also fundamentally failing to celebrate what's positive about our society.
Yeah.
Right? The fact that in a place like New York, where I am right now, there's people from all over the world, and they're butting up against each other and co-creating and influencing each other and letting themselves be inspired. That's part of the great beauty of New York City in 2023, not one of the things we should be afraid of.
Yeah. I always recommend Matt Ridley's book, How Innovation Works, in which he shows all innovation is appropriation. Everybody, is copying other people and then pushing just a little bit in a different direction. no invention ever has, come out of the blue. It just, they just build on each other. I was like those lawsuits about, some musician stole somebody else's opening notes or whatever, like Stairway to Heaven. And then it comes out like, well, they all rip each other off in a way, because there's only so many variations on a theme. So you take a theme and you rework it and make it your own. It's all like that.
Yeah, I sort of want to open a restaurant called Appropriation with, I don't know, I've always wanted to figure out. I'm experimenting with it a little bit, how to use Szechuan peppers in more Italian pasta recipes. I think it's a natural ingredient for Italian cuisine. If Italy had that spice, there's so many wonderful ways in which we can be in conversation with each other and build on each other. That is what I love about it.
Yeah. Well, all the stuff you talk about in your book, I'm on board with. I do think it's a problem. But what do you say to people that say, you're exaggerating the problem? People like, I just heard Noam Chomsky on a podcast a few weeks ago saying, oh, critical race theory, come on, this is just this obscure legal theory. It's not being taught by grammar school teachers to kids. And, this is a right-wing moral panic and so on.
Yeah, I think that's just a mistake. So when it comes to critical race theory, there are people on the right who call anything they don't like critical race theory, right? If you're going to teach kids about slavery, that's critical race theory. And that's, of course, absurd. Of course, we should teach American children about the terrible history of racial injustice and slavery in this country. But as a result, a lot of people on the mainstream and the left, including smart people like Noam Chomsky, end up saying, well, critical race theory, that's just wanting to speak critically about race in society, right? What could be wrong with that? Or they say, well, that's an academic theory, and first graders aren't reading the academic articles published in law reviews by Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Sure. But the ideas that I chronicle in this book do help to inform deeply how schools now teach children. Going back to what the left stood for, it used to be that most teachers thought, my task is to make children realize that they have things in common. To make them think, hey, perhaps in our society, I'm deeply defined by the fact that I'm white and you're black. But in this classroom, I want them to think of each other as friends, as members of the same classroom community, perhaps as teammates if they play a sport, right? And that's going to allow them to reduce prejudices against each other, to share an identity as Americans, to sustain a scheme of social solidarity, to overcome historical injustices. Well, under the influence of ideas of post-colonial thinkers like Gayatri Spivak, as well as of critical race theorists like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, that has radically changed in many schools. Some private schools in this country now have racially segregated affinity groups in elementary school. We're not talking about 16-year-olds here who, of their own free accord want to go hang out with people who they think of as being similar to themselves. We're talking about teachers walking into classrooms in the third grade, in the second grade, in the first grade, and saying, if you're black, you go to that classroom. If you're Asian American, you go to that classroom. If you're Latino, you go to that classroom. If you're white, you go to that classroom over there. And I worry a lot about what's going to happen to the white kids in those groups. Not because they might be uncomfortable. That's a part of an education. I think it's fine for kids to be uncomfortable sometimes. But because everything we know from social psychology is that how we define ourselves is malleable. But once I say, this is my in-group and that over there is your out-group, I'm capable, as we've been discussing earlier, to have endless empathy for my group and terrifying disregard for the suffering of the other group. So the aim here may be to create great white anti-racists. I think it's much more likely to create white supremacists. The other thing I would say is that these ideas not only now inform the norms and the practices of a great many institutions in the United States, important institutions like schools, they also inform public policy in really worrying ways. So perhaps the most shocking example of this that I experienced was when I sat in on a meeting of the ACIP, the key advisory group advising the Centers for Disease Control on how to roll out the great life-saving vaccines that we got during the pandemic. Now, we know that by far and away the best predictor of how seriously sick you will get from COVID is your age. And therefore, virtually every country in the world prioritized the elderly in the distribution of these vaccines. You might first go to hospital workers because in the middle of a pandemic, you don't want the doctor to be sick. But after that, nearly every country started with the over 85s, and then the over 80s, and then the over 75s. And that also made it easier to communicate this to the public. This is easy to say. From February 1st, the over 80s are going to be eligible. From March 1st, the over 75s are going to be eligible, right? Well, ACIP said no. We have to care about racial equity. Older Americans are disproportionately white. And therefore, it would be unjust to give a vaccine to them first. Even for the CDC's own model shows that deviating from prioritizing the elderly would raise the death toll by between 0.5 to 6.5%. In other words, by thousands of human. And this had disastrous consequences. First of all, we ended up with a really weird hodgepodge system where some elderly were eligible, but so was a vast category of essential workers. Movie producers in Hollywood were essential workers. Finance executives in New York were essential workers. I, as a college professor in the state of Maryland, was an essential worker, even though I wasn't allowed to go on campus and teach kids because of a pandemic. It was absurd. Then who was able to get those appointments? Since everybody was eligible, but there was few spots. Well, the people like you or me who were able to refresh the website for hours and hours. The people like a good friend of mine who programmed a computer macro to, click on the right field before any human would be able to do so. People who were willing to drive 3, 4, 5 hours to remote corners of New York State because there was more availability at rural pharmacies. In other words, really privileged people. And finally, I suspect that more non-white people died as a result of this policy. Because if you give vaccines to 2 25-year-old Latino Uber drivers, rather than one 80-year-old Latino retiree, the numbers suggest that more Latinos are going to die. So here we have a decision by a public health authority about medical triage in the middle of a pandemic, a life and death situation, and confused bad ideas inspired by this ideology lead to a disastrous course of action. That's not somebody losing a job as a journalist at some small magazine. That's not people piling onto somebody on Twitter. These are real stakes.
Yeah, beliefs kill, and that's a good example. While you were talking, I was thinking of Jane Elliott's famous experiment of the blue eyes, brown eyes separating the kids and how rapidly they basically denounced each other. Paul Bloom's book, Against Empathy, be careful what you wish for with empathy. It drives people to be more in-group and less empathetic toward out-group members and so on. And I was just thinking of that. Where was that? There was a professor last week, I think, that separated Jewish students from non-Jewish students. And I think I tweeted something like, maybe you should try putting a yellow star on their jacket. What could go wrong?
It was in California. I don't want to get this wrong. I'm pretty sure it was in California.
Yeah.
I forget it which school.
Yeah. Oh,
it may in fact have been at Stanford, but I'm not certain.
Might have been. Actually, I think, was it UC Davis or UC? Anyway, yeah, I might have been Stanford. Yes. Okay. Right. So here, kind of looking back at the bigger picture, would you make a distinction between leftism and liberalism as you've conceived it, particularly that opening passages from your book about what you mean by liberalism?
Yeah. So,
would you just say they're not liberals, they're illiberals? Can you just,
yes.
Can we even just be blunt like that?
Yes, I absolutely. I think they are, the way I think about politics, there's two sets of distinctions. There's that between liberals and authoritarians, and there's that between the left and the right. I am a center-left liberal. I'm on the left. I've historically been on the left. I joined the German Social Democratic Party at the age of 13. I had to lie about my age to join it because by law you're only allowed to join it when you're 14. So I can claim, as long an allegiance to the left as anybody who's my age, at least. Perhaps people who are a few decades older can claim a longer allegiance, but it's not. That's beyond my agency. But I think the more important distinction is that between liberals and authoritarians, that between people who want to impose their views by force, who have no tolerance for people who disagree with them, who see the world as split into the good and the evil. Those are authoritarians. And then there's people who are liberal, who say you can have legitimate political disagreements with me. I want a society in which people have free speech and the right of free assembly and the right of free worship. And even if I win a majority, I'm not going to impose my substantive moral views on you. And I recognize that just because you take what I consider the wrong position on some political issue, that doesn't make you an evil person. Those are liberals. And I think the liberal authoritarian distinction is more important than the left-right distinction. I'm happy to be friends with people, to think of people as my political allies who are on the center left and the center right, on the far left or the pretty far right, as long as they are liberals. I do not want to be friends with authoritarians, politically speaking. I don't want to be friends with authoritarians, whether they're on the far right or the far left, or whether they have views that might in some complicated way be described as centrist.
So there is such a thing as left-wing authoritarianism, just like there is right-wing authoritarianism.
I mean, how can you look at the history of the 20th century without recognizing? And the thing about left-wing authoritarianism, which can give you more sympathy for it, but should also scare you about it, is that it's much easier for people who think they're doing good in the world to fall foul. Right-wing authoritarianism usually is an explicit ethno-nationalism, right? It is saying the German people are superior to all other people. And so the devaluation of others is implicit in it. Left-wing authoritarianism often claims that it is for the good of all humanity, right? That we are creating paradise on earth, not just for one group, but for everybody. And that can be very appealing, right? My grandparents, and I loved my grandparents. I think my maternal grandfather, for example, was a deeply decent human. They were attracted to these ideas for understandable reasons. Growing up in shtetls where they were discriminated, poverty, thinking this is what's going to fight for the rights of proletarians, and we're all going to be brethren, the people of the world are going to unite. We're not going to discriminate against each other just because of who we are. I can completely see how, as a 16, 17-year-old, my grandparents, for the best of reasons, ended up embracing that tradition. But it ended up making them complicit in a very bad dictatorial regime. And so I think I have empathy for people who are tempted by this set of ideas, but I'm also aware of how easily they can seduce, and seduce in ways that make you complicit in genuine evil.
Yeah, I call that utilitarian utopianism. We can get to utopia, except for that one group over there that's holding us back. If just get rid of them, and we'll make it. And that's the history of the world right there.
Yeah, I recently read a classic, but I think it's the kind of classic that everybody knows of, but nobody has read, called "Darkness at Noon" by Arthur Koestler.
Arthur Koestler, yes, classic.
And it is better than any other book, I think, in describing the allure and the danger of, at least, the communist version of left-wing authoritarianism. Right? How even somebody who's innocently arrested, but who's a loyal member of a movement, to justify to themselves why their arrest is necessary and in fact is serving the greater good. It's a really beautifully observed and written treatment of how these ideas can lure you into an embrace of a deeply illiberal and therefore dehumanizing ideology.
Almost like a sanction of the victim. The victim themselves think it's a good idea on some level.
Well, that is sort of the tour de force in the novel, right? That how can somebody end up justifying it to themselves in those kinds of way? And I think it tells it
versus the idea of pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else believes something, so they go along with it, when in fact most of them don't believe it. Right? So I'm often conflicted about this. What percentage of the German people really bought into the whole National Socialism political platform all the way to the exterminationist policies and war policies, versus once Hitler came to power and shut down the press and started locking people up, anybody with an eye can look around and go, well, I'm just going to keep my head down and my mouth shut. Even though most people don't believe it, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably varied from moment to moment as well. I think there was a moment in the mid to late 1930s when Hitler was, by all accounts, genuinely popular. And there were certain referenda, and certainly there was risks in voting no and so on. But where my understanding is, and I'm not a great expert on this, that most historians believe that there really was very broad and genuine support. But of course, in 1933, the country was much more split, and I think during the war it became more split as well.
Yeah, you wonder about that with Putin too. Supposedly, if they actually ran a legitimate election, he'd still win. Maybe not now, but certainly before.
Certainly before the Ukraine war. Yeah, you must think that nowadays there's some discontent. Perhaps there isn't. It is obviously hard to have. I know there's some organizations that still try to pull Russians in an independent way, but whether or not you can trust what somebody will tell you if you call them up on the phone and say, how do you feel about Vladimir Putin right now? I mean, certainly I don't think I would give an honest answer about that to a stranger if I was living.
Right. But this gets to that deeper question that I asked before about, do they really believe what they're saying, the student groups or whatever? You talk about corporations in your book, adopting these identity politics, DEI training and the sensitivity programs all employees have to go through, and the kind of self-emulation of these CEOs when something bad happens in their company, or Disney, going woke or whatever. Do they really believe this stuff, or are they just looking at the landscape going, well, this is the trend, so we got to stay on top of it, so let's publicly signal our support of LGBTQ and so on and so forth? What is your sense about that?
I think on slightly firmer ground, I would say that there's a real split, right? There's true believers. There's certainly true believers in HR departments. There's true believers who make a good living as diversity consultants. There's also some true believers in the elite class. There's some true believers among CEOs and so on. At the same time, there's a lot of people who have an incentive to shut up and stay quiet. People who are rolling their eyes privately, but who are not that politically motivated, and who are saying, is it really worth my while to push back against this? I'm going to be marked out as a troublemaker, and perhaps somebody will accuse me of being a racist or a bigot. I'll just keep my mouth shut. And there's an interesting legal incentive for CEOs to go along with some of this, which is that if your company is sued for racial discrimination or sexual harassment, whether or not you have engaged in industry standard practices to avert those forms of bias is a key defense. So once your free competing companies offer a Robin DiAngelo style, deeply divisive diversity training, you actually have a legal incentive to do that. If you don't, then a plaintiff might use that to say, they didn't hire DiAngelo, clearly they don't care about this stuff, so it's on them that some form of racial discrimination or gender discrimination supposedly took place in this company. So I think that there is a incentive from social sanction, that speaking up against these ideas is perilous. And there is also an incentive from the actual legal regime we now have in the United States in terms of how you can defend yourself against lawsuits, no matter how frivolous. And then the last thing I'll say is that, there's a real equilibrium between minorities of people, ideological minorities of people who are very loud on these subjects, and majorities who don't have the same anger and passion. So, why is it that just about every institution I'm affiliated with talks about Latinx people, when polls show that about 98% of Hispanics prefer the term Latino or Hispanic? Well, the answer is that if you're the president of some think tank, let's say, and you write Latino, most of your employees are going to agree with that, including most of the Hispanic employees. but 7 people will write an email of protest and try and get a story in the newspaper and say, why are you using this offensive language, right? If you say Latinx, 95% of your employees might roll their eyes, but the people who would actually gun through your head are going to be mollified. And so the incentive, the path of least resistance, is to just go along to get along.
Yeah. And given how deep this is in education and those kids are going to graduate and go into corporate America, are you worried in the coming decades this is going to get worse?
Yeah. I teach at college, and my students are right in an important sense that they're smart and thoughtful and they want to talk about the world. I teach some of these subjects in school and make it clear that I'm not there to convert them to any point of view. I'd rather they disagree with me intelligently and they parrot my views back to me. But they're genuinely thankful to have a space in which we can have those conversations and which they can reflect on these ideas. But on day one, when we walk into the classroom, they are deeply and fundamentally shaped by these ideas, because especially if they went to private schools, they went to schools in good school districts in affluent, liberal-leaning parts of the country, these ideas have been drummed into them from day one. It's the water that they swim in, and they take much of it.
Yeah, I'm worried about that too. What can we do about it? Your whole last chapter is, here's some of the steps. Give us some actionable things that listeners can go, okay, tomorrow I'm going to do whatever.
Well, the first is to argue back against these ideas from the moral high ground. And part of that is to argue on the basis of principles that you deeply believe in and that might make the world a better place. Now, I don't care what those principles are, or at least there's a broad range of principles that are, compatible with liberalism that you can embrace. Perhaps you have a religious motivation, perhaps you're a socialist, perhaps you're a conservative. All of that is fine. My conviction is that of a philosophical liberal, as well as somebody in the American context who has great admiration for certain movements, which you might call identity politics if you like, but they tried to bring this nation into closer alliance, into closer comportment with its universal founding values. Frederick Douglass, when he was invited to hold a speech commemorating the 4th of July, called out his compatriots on the hypocrisy, saying, "You're talking about all men being created equal. How can you celebrate with value and pat yourselves on the back when Black people around the country are enslaved right this moment?" But he didn't say, let's rip up that value. He said, let's live up to it. If you mean your commitment to those values seriously, then you need to fight so that I and other people like me are also covered by those values. He recognized that newspapers and magazines across the American South and beyond said terrible things about Black people at the time. But he didn't reject free speech. He called free speech the dread of tyrants, because he realized that it was what allowed genuine political minorities, people who were very unpopular in their time, to fight for abolitionism when that cause was very far from obvious. And the same is true of Martin Luther King Jr. In some ways, the same is true of Barack Obama. So I think, argue on behalf of a political tradition that roots your values. And that allows you to argue from a position of calm confidence. I might be wrong about what I believe. Right? We all might be wrong about what we believe. But the reason why I care about this, the reason why I'm talking about this, is that it's my considered opinion about how to create a better world. And that's the spirit in which you should argue. And part of that is to avoid the obvious pitfalls that I sometimes see people fall into when they argue against what I call the anti-Semitism, against quote-unquote wokeness.
Yeah.
One of those, good.
Well, I was just going to give a couple more points from your what we can do about it. Don't vilify those who disagree. So what? Be respectful and ask questions, but don't accuse them of being Hitler. And remember, today's adversaries can become tomorrow's allies. How do you convert somebody from an adversary to an ally?
Well, so Ibu Patel is somebody who I respect greatly. He's a great interfaith organizer in Chicago. Somebody who's whose parents have roots in India. He himself is Muslim. And he has written about how shaped he was by some of these ideas in college. He went and encountered these ideas in college, and they seem to him to explain his childhood in Illinois at a time when there was a mostly white community, and he explained certain forms of pleasure. He said, "This is the key. This helps me explain everything that's going on in the world." But over time, he started to recognize that the ideology was destructive rather than constructive. He had a teacher he admired who he took an independent study with, and then went to see a play of hers. And in the talkback session, he was the first to raise his hand. She was an African-American woman, a playwright. And Ibu Patel said, this play is terribly racist and colonialist. All of the children in this family have their own rooms. What about families where the children don't have their own rooms, right? And the professor very graciously emailed him a few days later saying, Ibu, thanks for your critique. It's easy to criticize. It's hard to build, right? If you think you can do better, write a play that's better, right? You're always going to be able to use these categories to tear things down. Why don't you try and build? And Ibu realized that this ideology had seduced him into being negative, into being critical, into not being constructive. And so he set out to build this interfaith organization as something that could actually inspire people to understand each other and be in communication with each other and have political solidarity, right? So he's somebody who's changed his mind. But Mo Mitchell, the head of the Working Families Party, has as well. Many people have changed their mind. The key about changing your mind is it's never going to happen in the middle of the argument, right? What I'm sure has never happened in the history of your podcast, never happened in the history of my podcast, other than on some small points or something, right? Is I make the brilliant argument and boom, you realize the error of your ways. I'm intellectually superior. My view is right. No, but think about friends you have, right? Think about yourself. Do you have the same political views that you held 20 years ago? Do all of your friends hold the same political views? No, many of them have shifted in deep and important ways. And that's because the force of argument over time has transformed them, has shifted where they stand. So argue with patience. Talk to people who are persuadable rather than the most ideological extremes. Don't spend your time on social media shouting at people who are insulting you. Seek out people in real life with whom to have a conversation about those things. Don't be a jerk. Don't say, you're going to hate what I say anyway. I know the moment I say this, you're going to accuse me of terrible things. So I'm going to, throw you a barb. That makes it easy for them to say you're an asshole. Don't be overly nervous either. Don't say, well, of course you're right about everything. And I'm so sorry. I know you're going to think terrible things about me if I say this. But no, then you're communicating your guilt before you say something. Argue from that calm confidence, saying, here are my convictions, here's the beliefs that I have, here's why this is important to me. I want to build a better world just like you. Here's why I think my way is more likely to do that.
Did I quit using the word woke? Because I often say, oh, those woke crazies or something like that. That word has become so pejorative now, at least in some circles. Well, this is the
weird thing about this ideology, right? It's the ideology that dare not speak its name. And it's different from others, right? Socialism, some people love socialism, some people hate socialism, but they can all agree to call it socialism. And here there's not a word. I think the blogger Freddie DeBoer once said, just tell me what on earth to call this thing. Yeah. I'll call it the thing. If that's what you prefer. I don't care. Just tell me what name I'm allowed to use. So I wrote woke because just nowadays it makes it sound a little bit like an old man shouting at the clouds. And so I guess I avoid the term, not out of any deep conviction. I use identity synthesis, which doesn't roll over the tongue, but which helps me in the book to talk about these ideas. So I don't really care that much what exactly we call it.
As a student of democracy, are you hopeful for the coming, say, rest of the century?
No, hopeful would be an exaggeration. I do worry about the state of democracy in the United States and in a number of other places around the world. I think we got relatively lightly through the first stint of office of Donald Trump. There was no major international crises. He did not have full control of the Republican Party when he took office. I don't think he recognized to what extent he was enraged by limits on his power early in his reign. And he was actually in a more hopeful mood. I mean, he was still talking mostly about all the great things he's going to do for America. Now he has full control over the Republican Party. He has at his disposal loyalists who have 4 years of governing experience. he is much angrier than he was in 2016, and will set out from day one to overcome limits on what he can do, to fight against what he calls the deep state. And so I'm very worried about what would happen in the United States if Donald Trump wins the 2024 elections. And all polls suggest that that is a very, very distinct possibility. My gut feeling right now is that the likelihood is just over 50%. If you gave me an even bet between Biden and Trump, I think I would bet on Trump right now. So I am very concerned about
this. Me too. How is it we have these two guys? I mean, in a population of 300 million adults, I mean, come on. Where is everybody?
But I will say one important thing, which is that I'm sometimes asked, look, if you're worried about Trump, then why worry about the left, right? If a concern from people like Trump is bigger, then why are you writing about the left? Aren't you being distracted? Aren't you? Now, part of the answer is, well, my previous two books and a lot of my writing has been about the threat of right-wing populism, and I don't like repeating myself too much, so I just didn't have another damn book about far-right populism in me. But part of the answer is more substantive, which is that even though ideologically they seem like antidotes, one actually is the yin to the other's yang. It was Trump's victory in 2016 which made it so hard to push back against some of these bad ideas on the left, because you could be accused of running interference for Trump, of being a traitor. But it is the hold that these ideas now have over many mainstream institutions and over much of the left that explains why Trump is running head-to-head with Biden in the polls. I don't agree with this assessment, but most Americans are more likely to say that the Democratic Party is too extreme than that the Republican Party is too extreme. According to an analysis in the newspaper we started, the podcast by Maligning, the New York Times, about 10% of voters for the Republican Party now are a new set of Republican voters who are predominantly young, predominantly non-white, predominantly socially progressive, but who are very worried about what they call wokeness and its hold in mainstream institutions. So the best way to fight against one of these ideologies is to fight against both. The best thing that Biden, despite his advanced age and despite all of his weaknesses as a candidate, could do to put himself on a road to beating Trump in 2024 is to very clearly draw a line between himself and the aspects or parts of the liberal left that Americans in the majority right.
I know, but he hasn't done that. He's embraced it seems.
And he won't.
Why? Is he a true believer, or is he afraid to lose that?
No, I think Biden is a moderate by instinct. I don't think he himself is woke. I'm not sure that, in fact, that's the reason why he's president. I mean, in the 2019-2020 Democratic primaries, the 17 candidates in the field all somehow concluded that they need to imitate and run after the craziest lefty voices on Twitter in order to win the primary election. And Biden was kind of too old and out of it to make the same pivot. And so inadvertently, he was in the right position and he won. So I don't think that he's woke or anything like that. But I do think that they decided very deliberately on a policy of no enemies to the left, that they thought, we have to reunite the party, and the party is to the left of Biden, and so we're going to create all these alliances with people. As a result, they have a lot of staffers and appointees who are far to the left. And Americans don't have the impression that Biden is fully in charge of his own administration. And so therefore, the combination of those two facts hurt him. If Biden was a sprightly man of 45, I think Americans would say, all right, there's some crazies in the administration, but Biden is reasonable, the buck stops with him, I kind of trust him to put an end to it, right? But since Americans have the impression of these crazy people in the Democratic Party coalition, and Biden himself is too old and out of it to really put an end to some of that stuff, to say, no, this is a mistake, he becomes tainted with these ideas much more than he otherwise might.
Is it possible that, let's say, the week after the election in 2024, we still don't have a clear winner? It's really close.
That is possible. I have always worried less about street violence than about a genuine institutional split in the institutions. We should say that in the end, in the United States, we have a vast police force and military, all of those things. Those terrible security failures on January 6th, which is part of what turned this from an irresponsible, stupid protest into a significant event in American history. If the Capitol Police had been better prepared, we would not know the date of that event. But the broader danger was that big institutional actors were unwilling to play by the rules of American democracy. We're unwilling to go along with the fact that the one key thing we have to agree on as Americans is that it's elections who determine who rules. We're spreading these conspiracy theories about the election supposedly being stolen. That was the true danger, not the people on the ground on January 6th. So there's been some projections of civil war and so on. But many of those are built on a kind of conceptual sleight of hand, where if you say there's a few deaths from political violence that counts as a civil war, and then I guess it's imaginable that we had a civil war in 2020, it's imaginable that we might have one in 2024. But that's using the term civil war in a sense that is very different from what people mean by it. The only way we would get an actual civil war is if there's a split in what the institutions think is a legitimate president, right? If some branches of the military come to the conclusion that Joe Biden is the legitimate president, and other branches of the military come to the conclusion that Donald Trump is the legitimate president, and therefore there's disagreement about who's the commander-in-chief, that is the world in which we are in really serious trouble. Now, I think there was reason for concern about that because of some legal theories making the rounds among conservatives about states being able to determine in a very autonomous way, but cannot be checked by the Supreme Court, who won the slates of electors. And because we had some secretaries of state and governor candidates who were election denialists, who seemed willing to claim that Arizona's electors go to the Republican slate, even if Democrats have more votes. Two factors have made me less concerned about that for 2024, which is firstly the passage of the Electoral Count Act, which clarifies some of those ideas, as well as the Supreme Court's rejection of the states' rights theory on how to determine the legitimate outcome of the election. And secondly, that at least in swing states, the craziest of these candidates, like Carrie Lake, lost. And so they're not going to be in a position to make decisions in 2024. So I think 2024 is going to be perilous. I think it's going to be nasty. I could imagine forms of street clashes and violence that'll be very unpleasant, that might cost some innocent people their lives, which is hardly a trivial matter. But in terms of the risk of an actual breakdown of political transition or the risk of something resembling an actual civil war, never say never. And things have turned out to be as crazy as they possibly can each time for the last 8 years. But I don't think that's on the cards. And the Supreme Court has played a very important role that those of us on the left don't often recognize. I disagree with a good number of Supreme Court rulings in the last years. But when it came to the 2020 election, there was lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit that the Trump campaign brought that were rejected by Trump-appointed and Bush-appointed and Reagan-appointed judges up and down the hierarchy, from very right-leaning district courts in Texas all the way up to the Supreme Court. The current conservative jurists in the judiciary are not willing to make themselves complicit in an overturning of American democracy. That might change. Everybody in American life seems to be living up to the worst stereotypes of them all of the time. But in 2020, on this question, the courts actually acted in a very honorable way.
Yeah, certainly. And so we're left with the kind of the MAGA cult, you might say. Just doesn't seem to bother these people. Why is that?
Well, I think partially they don't see it, but partially it's the impression that they don't trust either side, right? So there are some hardcore fans of Donald Trump who love him and will always love him. But Donald Trump is a very unpopular man. He's one of the most unpopular politicians in the country. And most Americans have a strongly negative view of him. The problem is that most Americans also have a strongly negative view of Democrats. Now, the good thing is that's something that Democrats could do something about. If only they jettisoned some of the sense that people have that they're imposing the culture on the country, but they're not willing to stand up for what's sensible, that they're going along with all kinds of forms of bullshit out of politeness, they could move into the center. And that's all it takes, because remember that Trump is not popular. So in a way, I think we should look ourselves in the mirror, right? The question is not, why do they love him so much? The question is, why, even for most of them recognize that he's pretty bad, do they still not prefer us?
Right. So it's on the Democrats to make their own case stronger. All right, Yasha, The Identity Trap. Love the book. Really important. What's on your back burner for the next couple of years? What's for your research and writing?
Oh God, I published 2 books in 2 years, so I think I deserve a break. I grew up in Germany, and so I was humorless until I was 18. So I want to prove to myself that I have a sense of humor by surviving, 7 minutes on stage as a stand-up comedian at some point. So I'm going to go and go to some terrible open mics and see whether I can hold the attention of people through jokes for 7. I don't think I'm going to be good at it. I just want to be, good enough that I don't get booed off stage. No, I'm starting to think about possible ideas for the next book, but I'm not in a rush. And in the meanwhile, I really want to bring this argument to people. I very consciously have 2 audiences in mind for this book, and I never normally think about the audience for books. It's always a question publishers ask, and it's always a question for which I don't have an answer. But I want to reach people who are torn, who see the allure of some of these ideas, but who are also starting to see how they go wrong. And I want to reach people who already dislike those ideas, but who I think are in need of the best, the most sincere, the most profound set of arguments against them, because the contestation over these ideas is going to last for the next 20 or 30 years. So if you agree with me, buy the book, because I promise it'll give you the ammunition that you need in order to argue back against those ideas. And if you have a brother or a sister-in-law who is reasonable but tempted by these ideas, give her the book, and perhaps you can discuss it together, because I really want to make the case for why, well-intentioned as many of the followers of this ideology may be, they're making a mistake, and it's making it harder for us to build the kind of society in which we all deserve to live.
Yeah, I'd love to see you make a case for liberalism, or at least classical liberalism, for conservatives. Why conservatives should embrace most of these liberal attitudes. They can still be conservative, just right of center rather than left of center, something like that.
Well, and part of that, I think, is what I am doing in the book. It's not directly directed at them, but I want to make sure that people who are really bothered by wokeness, who really dislike it, don't think, in order to consistently oppose it, I have to run all the way to the far right, or I have to embrace conspiratorial thinking. Right? I want to show that you can be sensible and moderate and fact-based and recognize injustices in our society, preserve the traditional liberal values that animate at its best the spirit of our Constitution, and stand up in a decided way against these ideas. That's what I'm trying to model, and that should be attractive to conservatives as well.
And you do that. You accomplish it quite well. All right, that's a good place to stop. Thank you, Yasha. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.